I found the whistle in my daughter's backpack on an ordinary Tuesday, not on the day of a catastrophe, not after a scandal, but on the very day that was supposed to be safe. 3 months later, that man was dead. It was buried deep between a folded math worksheet covered in careful pencil marks and an apple that had bruised into softness, its skin broken and leaking sugar. And the whistle itself was old, scratched, and dulled, the plastic worn thin as if it had been pressed against teeth more than once. It was not a toy, not a novelty, not something a child carries for fun. And the small metal ring was bent in a way that suggested panic rather than play. My daughter was sitting at the kitchen table, cutting colored paper for a school project with deliberate, almost surgical precision, her shoulders tense, her breathing measured, humming quietly to herself as if sound itself could hold her together. Children do not move like that unless they have learned that suddenness is dangerous, and I understood this only later, when it was already impossible to unsee. I held the whistle up between my fingers and asked her what it was, keeping my voice level, neutral, casual in the way mothers learn to be when they sense a storm but do not yet know its shape. She did not look up at first, and when she answered, the words came too quickly, sliding out as if they had been rehearsed in advance, polished and prepared for inspection. She told me it was for breathing practice, that her coach said it helped with control and focus, and she smiled immediately after saying it. A smile that arrived too early and lingered too long. A smile that did not reach her eyes. The word coach lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and unresolved, though at the time I could not have explained why. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet mine, I saw that her eyes were already elsewhere, fixed on some invisible point beyond the kitchen walls. And in that moment I understood, without yet admitting it to myself, that she had already learned how to leave a room without moving her body. I told her okay, because that is what you say when you want to believe the lie more than you want the truth. And that was my first failure. The second came a week later, on the schoolyard, under a sky so clear and harmless it felt like a mockery. He was standing near the fence with a disposable coffee cup in one hand and a clipboard tucked under his arm, laughing openly at something one of the boys had said, his voice carrying easily across the concrete, confident and warm, the kind of sound that invites trust without demanding it. Children clustered around him naturally, drawn by gravity rather than instruction, and parents nodded to him as they passed, relieved in the quiet way adults are relieved when someone else seems to be doing the work of care.
He wore the uniform of respectability without effort. Clean sneakers, a school hoodie, a calm posture that suggested authority without aggression, and when someone addressed him, they used his name with affection, sometimes adding, "Sir," as if instinctively acknowledging a hierarchy that felt safe. I watched him as I stood there, pretending to check my phone, pretending not to stare, and then I saw him place his hand on my daughter's shoulder. It was not a brief touch, not an absent-minded gesture, not the kind of contact you could excuse as accidental or benign, and what made it unbearable was not only its duration, but its confidence, the way it dared the world to challenge it. My chest tightened, and for a split second, I felt foolish, dramatic, hysterical in the way women are trained to feel when their instincts flare without evidence to justify them. I told myself I was tired, that motherhood rewires the brain to see threats everywhere, that I was projecting fear where there was none. And I repeated all the sensible explanations people offer when they want a woman to doubt herself. Then my daughter flinched. It was subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it, a barely perceptible pause in her breathing, a tightening of her shoulders. But I saw it because she was mine, because I had known her body since before it was a body at all.
His hand did not move. That night, when we were alone, I asked her how training was going, choosing my words carefully, placing them gently, like stepping on ice you are not sure will hold. She shrugged without looking at me and said it was fine. I asked her if she liked her coach, and she shrugged again, repeating the motion as if it were a reflex rather than an answer, and told me that he was nice. Nice is the most dangerous word in the language, because it is what we use to cover the things we are not allowed to say. I waited after that, telling myself that pressure would only make her retreat further, that she needed space, that trust would bring truth in its own time, and every parenting book I had ever read murmured approval in the background. Patience, they said, as if patience were not a privilege reserved for those who can afford to be wrong. In the days that followed, she began to change in ways that felt incremental but relentless, like erosion. She slept lightly and badly, waking at the smallest sound, and more than once I found her sitting fully dressed on the edge of her bed long before morning, shoes on, backpack packed, as if she needed to be ready to run at a moment's notice. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she could not sleep, and when I asked why, she said she did not know. I went to her teacher first, framing my concern carefully, keeping my tone light, because women learn early that worry becomes accusation if you are not cautious enough. I told her that my daughter seemed quieter lately and asked if everything was all right at school. And the teacher smiled with professional ease and assured me that she was doing well, that children go through phases, and that the sports program had been wonderful for her. She spoke of the coach with open admiration, calling him a positive influence, saying how lucky the school was to have someone so dedicated. Lucky was the word everyone used. I went to the school counselor next, who nodded thoughtfully and took notes as I spoke, asking about stress, about puberty, about friendships, about screens and social media. And when I mentioned the coach by name, her pen paused for just a moment before she smiled and said gently that he was very well regarded, and that she would hate for me to worry unnecessarily. Unnecessarily felt like a warning disguised as kindness. I spoke to the principal after that, sitting across from him in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and he sighed heavily as if burdened by my presence, explaining that accusations of this nature were serious and that the school had to be careful. I realized as he spoke that I had not accused anyone of anything, not explicitly, and yet I was already being treated as though I had crossed a line. At home, the silence thickened. One night, after I tucked her in, I asked her the question I had been circling for weeks, the one that had lodged in my throat like a splinter. I asked her if someone had hurt her. She stared at the wall for a long time, her face empty of expression, and the silence stretched until it became something heavy and alive between us, something that pressed on my chest and made it hard to breathe. Finally, in a voice so quiet it barely existed, she told me that he had said no one would believe her, and that if she told me, I would think she was lying. That sentence landed with the finality of something rehearsed, something carefully planted and watered. And I understood then how long this had been happening, how deeply he had already reached into her sense of reality. I held her as she shook, feeling how thin she had become, how tightly she folded herself inward, as if trying to take up less space in the world, and something inside me hardened into a shape I did not yet recognize. The next morning, I went to the police. They were polite and measured and impossibly calm, listening as I spoke, nodding at appropriate intervals, asking questions in neutral voices. And when I finished, one of them explained that children can misunderstand situations, that memories are unreliable, and that cases like this are complicated. Another asked if I had any evidence.
evidence, as if trauma leaves fingerprints.
They suggested observation, documentation, time. And when I left the station, I felt hollowed out by the understanding that by the time there was proof, there would already be damage that could not be undone. From that moment on, something in me sharpened. I stopped asking for permission, stopped seeking validation, and began to watch. I learned his schedule with the attention of someone studying an enemy, noting when he arrived, when he left, how he lingered after sessions, how he always volunteered to lock up, how children drifted away one by one while adults trusted the building to behave itself. I learned the way he spoke when no other adults were around, softer and slower, as if telling a secret meant only for chosen ears. I learned how the gym sounded after hours, the echo of footsteps on polished floors, the hum of fluorescent lights, the way familiar places become hostile when fear inhabits them. One evening, my daughter asked me if she still had to go to training, and when I told her no, relief washed over her so visibly that it broke my heart in a new way. That was when he called. His voice on the phone was warm and concerned, asking after her absence, saying he hoped everything was all right at home, emphasizing the importance of consistency and routine, and ending with the assurance that he only wanted what was best for her. So did I. The night I went to the gym, I was not angry. I was focused.
I waited until the lights dimmed the way he liked them, until the building emptied and silence settled into its corners. And when I stepped inside, he looked at me first with surprise and then with amusement. He told me I should not be there, his tone light, almost playful, and I agreed, because he was right. He smiled then, confident and unafraid, and told me calmly that I had nothing, that no one would believe me. I believed me, and for the first time since this began, that felt like enough. I did not confront him that night, not in the way people imagine confrontations, with raised voices and accusations flung like stones, because I understood something essential as I stood there under the humming lights and watched his smile settle back into place. Noise would only make him stronger. Men like him feed on spectacle, on chaos, on the comfort of knowing that emotion can be reframed as instability. Instead, I spoke calmly, asking him how long he had been working with children, how many parents trusted him, how carefully he curated the image that wrapped around him like armor. His smile tightened just slightly, the way a knot does when you pull on the wrong thread, and he answered with practiced ease, telling me about certifications, background checks, years of service, community programs, charity work. The language of virtue flowing so smoothly, it might have convinced me if I had not already seen what lived underneath it.
I told him that my daughter would not be returning. He shrugged, a small, careless movement, and said children come and go, and that he hoped she would find something else that made her happy. And when I mentioned the whistle, his eyes flickered for less than a second before settling again. It was enough. "You're imagining things," he said gently, and the gentleness was deliberate, weaponized. "You should be careful. Accusations can ruin lives." I agreed with him again, because agreement disarms better than resistance. And then I left, carrying with me the certainty that words would never be sufficient. In the weeks that followed, the world returned to its rhythms, and from the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. He continued his work, parents continued to smile at him, children continued to cluster around him, and the building continued to swallow the sounds that no one wanted to hear. I moved through my days with the careful normality of someone living a double life, cooking dinners, helping with homework, laughing at the right moments, while inside my mind,
a different calendar was being marked. I watched him from a distance, learning not just where he went, but how he thought, how he positioned himself within the invisible structures of trust and authority. He was careful, I realized, not reckless, and that care was what made him dangerous. He chose his moments with precision. He selected children who were quiet, he compliant, he eager to please, and he wrapped his control in the language of mentorship and care. My daughter began to change once she stopped going to the gym, but not in the way I had hoped. The fear did not evaporate. It simply turned inward. She startled easily. She flinched at unexpected touch. She apologized for things that did not require apology. And sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, she would go very still, her eyes unfocused, as if listening to something I could not hear. One night she asked me if he would come to our house. I told her no, with a certainty that surprised even me, and she nodded, accepting the answer the way children accept promises from adults, with hope and caution intertwined. After that, she began to sleep a little better, and I understood that safety, even imagined safety, can be a powerful thing. I returned to the police with what I had gathered: timelines, observations, patterns that felt obvious to me but were received with professional detachment. They thanked me, assured me they would note my concerns, and reminded me again that without concrete evidence, their hands were tied. The phrase lodged in my mind, heavy and immovable. Hands are only tied if you choose not to untie them. I stopped expecting help from institutions after that. Instead, I turned to patience of a different kind, the kind that waits not for justice, but for opportunity. I learned the building's maintenance schedule, the nights when security was minimal, the predictable complacency that settles in when routines go unquestioned. I learned that he liked to stay late on Fridays, when parents were eager to start their weekends and children were hurried out the door. I also learned that he was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with isolation, a loneliness born of secrecy and entitlement, and that this made him careless in moments when he believed himself untouchable. The call came sooner than I expected. He left a message saying he had noticed my daughter watching him from across the street earlier that day, which was a lie, and that he hoped everything was all right. His voice was smooth, almost friendly, but beneath it I heard something else, a testing of boundaries, a reminder of presence. That night, my daughter sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread out before her and asked me if bad people ever stop on their own. I told her the truth, that sometimes they do, and sometimes they have to be stopped. She nodded slowly, as if filing the information away for later use. I did not tell her what I was planning, because plans have weight, and I refused to place that weight on her shoulders. I waited until she was asleep, her breathing even and deep, and then I sat alone in the dark, considering the shape my life would take if I crossed the line I had been approaching for months. Fear was there, of course, but it was distant, muted by something older and stronger. I realized then that fear had already done its worst to us, and that whatever came next would be different, but not necessarily worse. The night I returned to the gym, it was raining, the kind of steady, unremarkable rain that erases footprints and dulls sound. The building was quiet, the parking lot nearly empty, and the lights inside glowed dimly through the glass like something underwater. He was there, as I knew he would be. When he saw me, his expression shifted through surprise to irritation and finally to amusement, settling again into that familiar smile. He asked me what I wanted, his tone indulgent, as if humoring a child. I told him I wanted him to understand something. He laughed softly and said there was nothing to understand.
that I had lost, that he was still there, and my daughter was gone, and that this was how things worked. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed victory many times, who had seen doubt crumble in the faces of adults and learned to trust it. I told him he was wrong. The conversation that followed was quiet, almost mundane, and that was what made it unbearable.
I told him that I knew about the messages he sent from accounts that were not his real name, about the gifts that were framed as rewards, about the language he used to blur lines and shift blame. I told him things I should not have known, details that made his smile falter and his posture stiffen. For the first time, I saw uncertainty enter his eyes. He told me I was delusional, that I was obsessed, that I needed help. And then he said something that clarified everything. He said, no one would care. Something in me settled then, the way a verdict settles at the end of a trial. What happened next did not feel like rage or vengeance, and it did not unfold with the chaos people imagine when they think of violence. It felt deliberate, contained, the culmination of a long narrowing of options. I did not think of him as a man in that moment, or even as a person. I thought of him as a threat that had not been neutralized by any other means. I acted with the calm certainty of someone who has already grieved the life she is about to lose. When it was over, the silence felt heavier than before, pressing in from all sides. And I stood there for a long time, listening to my own breathing, to the rain against the windows, to the distant hum of a city that would wake the next morning unchanged. I left without hurry, knowing that urgency creates mistakes. And when I stepped back into the rain, it washed over me without judgment, as indifferent as the systems that had failed us. The story that followed was simple and clean, shaped by convenience and the desire for closure. An accident, a fall, tragic, unexpected, devastating for the community. People spoke of loss and disbelief, of a good man gone too soon, and I watched their faces for any sign of doubt and found none. At home, my daughter slept through the night for the first time in months. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, listening to the quiet, and understood that there was no going back to who I had been before, only forward into something narrower and darker, defined not by innocence, but by resolve. The city mourned him loudly. Candles appeared outside the gym, their flames trembling in plastic cups, handwritten notes tucked beneath them like offerings to an altar of disbelief. Parents hugged their children more tightly for a few days, speaking in hushed voices about how unfair the world could be, how tragedy chose the wrong people. His photos circulated everywhere, smiling, cropped just right, a face that inspired trust even in absence. They called him a mentor, a protector, a pillar. I watched the news with the sound turned off while my daughter colored at the kitchen table, her pencil moving with a freedom I had not seen in months. The lines she drew were no longer cramped or frantic. They stretched, they curved, they filled space. Grief is contagious when it is socially approved. Suspicion is not. The police knocked on my door 2 days later, polite and apologetic, asking routine questions, explaining procedures, assuring me that everyone who had ever interacted with him would be contacted. Their eyes skimmed past me, already satisfied, already certain of the shape this story would take. Accidents make people comfortable. They do not demand accountability.
I answered everything honestly, because honesty, when properly timed, can be the most effective camouflage. After they left, I locked the door and leaned against it, feeling the delayed tremor run through my legs. Not guilt, not regret. Something closer to aftermath. The body's realization that the danger has passed and it is finally allowed to feel. That night, my daughter asked if he was gone forever. Yes, I said. She thought about that, turning the word over in her mind, testing its edges. Then she asked something else, something that told me she understood more than she ever should have. Will he hurt anyone now? No, I said again, and this time the certainty was complete. For a while, life did something almost convincing. Mornings arrived without dread. School became a place instead of a threat.
My daughter laughed without checking the room first. Slept without shoes beside the bed. Forgot the whistle at the bottom of a drawer. I knew better than to call it healing. It was recovery under watch. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation concluded quietly. No foul play suspected. Case closed. The words were a gift to everyone who wanted to believe that monsters announce themselves, that evil looks different, that danger can be recognized before it takes what it wants. I returned to work. I smiled at neighbors. I participated in the theater of normalcy with the discipline of someone who understands its necessity. Then the first letter arrived. It was slipped between bills and flyers, unmarked, the paper cheap, the ink pressed too hard. You think it's over. That was all. No signature, no explanation. I stood in the hallway for a long time, the envelope hanging from my fingers, and felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. Fear implies uncertainty. This was recognition. I burned the letter that night, watching the paper curl and blacken, listening to the quiet crackle as it disappeared. I told myself it was a coincidence, a sick prank, someone capitalizing on the story for attention. The second letter arrived a week later. She belongs to us too. I did not burn that one. I placed it carefully in a folder between documents and receipts, because some things need to be remembered precisely. I checked the cameras I had never taken down. I walked the perimeter of the house the way I used to, counting steps, noting shadows, relearning vigilance that had never truly left me. I did not tell my daughter. Protection sometimes means isolation. The third letter confirmed what I already knew. You stopped one, not the others. The truth arrived not with panic, but with clarity. He had never been alone. The realization rearranged the past in brutal ways, moments clicking into place, the carefulness, the confidence, the absolute certainty that he would not be touched. He had known he was protected not just by reputation, but by numbers, by silence shared and guarded. Predators do not hunt without maps. I went back to the gym one afternoon under the pretense of retrieving old paperwork. The building felt different without him, emptier, but not safer. I watched the new staff, the familiar faces, the subtle shifts in behavior. Trust, I had learned, does not disappear when exposed. It migrates. A man near the equipment room avoided my eyes too quickly. Another lingered too long near a group of girls, his posture casual, his presence unnecessary. The system had not been dismantled, only one piece removed. The letters continued, each one more confident than the last, as if the sender understood that fear, once reintroduced, compounds. You made a mistake. You will pay for it.
I showed the police.
They were sympathetic, thorough, ineffective. No fingerprints, no camera footage, no proof. Always the same absence, always the same conclusion. I stopped asking for help. Instead, I started listening. The online forums were easy to find once you knew what you were looking for. Language coded just enough to evade scrutiny, jokes that were not jokes, complaints about overprotective parents, about hysteria, about men being punished for nothing. Names surfaced. Patterns emerged. One of them worked at the school. Another volunteered at a youth center 2 neighborhoods away. They spoke about him with reverence, a martyr, a warning. I understood then that what I had done had not ended anything. It had declared war. The 4th letter arrived on a Friday. Tomorrow. No other words. I did not sleep. At dawn, I sent my daughter to stay with a friend, smiling as I kissed her goodbye, promising I would pick her up in the evening. She hugged me tightly, the way children do when they sense something without being able to name it. "You'll be careful?" she said. "Yes," I answered. Careful does not always mean gentle. They came after dark. Not all at once. That would have been reckless. They were not reckless men. One tried the back door. Another circled the house. A third waited across the street, patient, observing. I let them. I had spent months preparing, not just my home, but myself. I knew the angles, the timing, the way sound traveled through the rooms. I knew which lights to leave on and which to kill. I knew fear intimately by then. I knew how it sharpened rather than dulled when you stopped running from it. The first one inside moved quietly, confidently, like someone who had done this before. He did not expect resistance, and that was his mistake. What followed was not heroic, and it was not cinematic. It was brutal, fast, and irrevocable. I used what I had, and what I knew, and what I had trained for. And when it was over, there was no triumph in it, only necessity completed. The others fled. They always do when the illusion of control breaks. The police arrived to a scene they could not ignore, evidence they could not dismiss, a narrative too fractured to be smoothed over. Names surfaced, connections unraveled, testimonies followed, hesitant at first, then unstoppable once silence cracked. They called it a network. They called it a scandal. They called me a survivor when the story broke, a woman who had defended herself against intruders, who had endured threats and fear. They did not ask why the house had been prepared like a fortress, why my movements had been so precise. They did not want that answer. Some truths are tolerated only when incomplete. The trials took years. Lives were ruined. Careers ended. Men who had been trusted for decades were suddenly strangers to the communities that had protected them.
Apologies were issued, policies rewritten, committees formed. My daughter grew.
She learned what happened slowly, carefully, in fragments appropriate to her age. She learned that her mother had believed her when no one else had. She learned that safety is not given, it is built, defended, sometimes at great cost. One evening, years later, she asked me if I regretted it. I thought about the woman I had been before, the one who believed the right words spoken to the right people would be enough. No, I said. The truth did not frighten her. It strengthened her. The world never fully forgives women who refuse to be quiet, but it remembers them. And sometimes, that is enough.